The letter from Edmund arrived on a Tuesday, folded small and smelling of cheap tobacco. Rosund read it standing in the servants' hall, her back against the cold stone wall, and she did not let her face change. The sum demanded had grown again. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that the 3 months she had been given now felt like 3 weeks pressed flat against each other. She refolded the letter along its original creases, tucked it inside her travelling coat, and held her palm flat against her ribs for a moment, pressing until the paper stopped rustling against the lining. This is where our story begins. Not with a ballroom, not with an introduction, not with the bright noise of a promising season, but with a young woman standing alone in a drafty corridor doing arithmetic in her head, while the smell of boiled beef drifted up from the kitchen and a coal fire hissed against a damp chimney flue somewhere below. Rosund Renham, 23 years old, daughter of a country gentleman who had died owing money he did not know he owed, had arrived at Eastmore House that October evening by the side door, as servants do, carrying one small box tied with a length of rope and a secret she had told no one in this house. The drive was long, and the hired cart had set her down at the gate lodge rather than carry her all the way around. She had walked the last quarter mile through the estate's outer grounds, her box under her arm, the gravel path pale in the failing light, the main house rising against the darkening sky ahead of her, like something assembled from the idea of permanence rather than the substance of it. 6 windows across the upper floor were entirely shuttered. She counted them from the path and did not slow her pace. The secret, if she were forced to name it plainly, was this. She was not born to service. She had been taught to read Greek before she was 9, had played the harp under a teacher whose own instruction had come from a Viennese master, and had spent her girlhood in a house not unlike Eastmore, smaller certainly, but furnished with the same particular quiet of a family that chose books over company. When her father died and the debts emerged, surfacing one after another like stones uncovered by a retreating tide, she had sold what could be sold and arranged what could be arranged. The one remaining arrangement was this. Her brother Edmund needed a commission before a Whitehall deadline. A commission cost £54, and Rosund had taken a position as a resident harpist in a great house because a harpist was the one skill she possessed that anyone would pay for. She had been a harpist before, briefly, at the Dalton household in Essex. A respectable enough arrangement, terminated when the family removed to the continent. The reference was good. The wage at Eastmore was slightly better. She arrived at the servants' entrance and was met, after a short wait, by Mrs. Hatch. Mrs. Hatch had been managing Eastmore for 19 years, and she had a gift, rare among housekeepers who generally prefer the company of certainties, for reading precisely what people were working not to show. She was a stout woman in black bombazine, her grey hair drawn very close under a white cap, a chatelaine of keys at her hip. She came to the doorway, took one look at Rosund, at the good posture, the worn gloves, the way she stood with her chin level and her shoulders composed in the manner of someone practicing composure rather than simply possessing it, and said, "Follow me," in a tone that expected compliance and received it without resistance. The servants' quarters occupied the basement of the north wing, and were cold in a way that suggested the cold was structural, not a failure of the fires, which were laid and reasonably tended, but a cold that lived in the stone itself. A cold cultivated by the centuries of pressure of damp earth on the outer walls. The floors were unfinished slate, worn to a grey sheen by the passage of feet over many decades. The passage between the kitchen and the laundry smelled of boiled beef and beeswax, and the faint brimstone and decay smell of a damp flue. A smell Rosund would come to know as intimately as her own name. The kitchen fire had been banked for the evening, and the coals settled with a soft, sustained hiss. the sound of a whispered argument that no one intends to resolve. At the servants' dinner, a plain meal of the remnant beef and potatoes, eaten at the long table in near silence, Rosund observed the household without asking questions. There were 6 of them at the table that evening. They spoke in the careful, abbreviated way of people accustomed to being overheard. Nobody introduced themselves. A girl of perhaps 15, thin-wristed and extraordinarily still, sat at the far end and ate with her eyes on her plate. Rosund noticed that when one of the footmen reached across the table without warning, the girl flinched visibly and did not appear aware that she had done it. Nobody else seemed to notice either. After dinner, Mrs. Hatch showed her the room, narrow on the inner corridor, a window that looked onto a stone wall, and paused in the doorway with the slight weight of something unfinished. "The other girls may tell you this house is unhappy," she said. "I prefer to say it is quiet. There is a distinction worth keeping in mind. You'll find your footing faster if you remember that the silence here is not directed at you." Rosund thanked her. Mrs. Hatch's gaze dropped briefly to the box in Rosund's hands, then back to her face, and something in her expression underwent a small, private reclassification. She said, "If you require anything before tomorrow morning," and left the sentence open, which was its own kind of welcome. When she had gone, Rosund sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the far wall. Then she set her box on the floor, untied the rope, and opened it. Most of what was inside was practical. 2 plain working dresses, a parcel of linen, a small jar of tooth powder, a purse containing what remained of her last quarter wages. These she set aside without examining them. What she lifted out carefully, both hands cupped beneath it, was a bundle wrapped in a shawl of green wool, faded at the folds, softened by long handling to something close to the texture of old moss. Inside the shawl, 12 pages of handwritten sheet music, the ink at several points blurred by what might have been water. Her mother had written them out years ago, in a spare evening, at the small table in the back parlour at home with the yellow curtains. A piece with no title, no attribution, composed for no occasion and intended for no audience except the room it was played in. Rosund had watched her write it, had watched the particular angle of her mother's wrist, the way she hummed very softly under her breath as she set down each phrase, as if checking that the marks on the page matched the sound she was carrying inside. After her mother died, Rosund had gone through the house looking for those pages, and found them inside the piano bench, slipped between 2 editions of Handel. She had taken them when everything else was sold. She touched the first page at the corner, where the ink had run slightly and dried in a small, dark stain. Her hands were not steady. She had been keeping them steady for approximately 4 months. Through the sale, through the Dalton household, through the interview with the Eastmore steward. And they were steady now in the sense that they did not shake visibly. But she had begun to notice, in quiet moments, a finer tremor. Something that lived below visibility. A hum in the fingers that was not quite fatigue. She set the music carefully on the small table by the bed, tucked the green shawl beneath it, and went to find a candle. By 9 o'clock, she had written to Edmund. It was the kind of letter she had become practiced in, careful in register, optimistic without offering specifics, saying enough to reassure and not enough to alarm. She told him the house was large and the household competent and the engagement a good one. She did not mention the letter from his creditors still pressed against her ribs. She had done the arithmetic, and there was a version of the next 3 months in which the sum worked out, and she wrote that version. But she also wrote this. The house is very large, Edmund, and very still. What I have seen of it suggests the kind of silence that a house only acquires when someone inside it has decided to stop listening. I do not know yet what it is they have decided not to hear. She sealed it and left it on the hall table for the morning post. On her way back, she passed a footman in the corridor, young, with a close-cropped reddish fringe and the off-duty ease of someone who has been told to stay available but given nothing specific to do. He was carrying a lamp and appeared to be going nowhere with great purpose. His name was Dawes, a nickname from his first month at Eastmore, earned by memorising the location of every door in the house on the reasoning that it was the most useful possible thing to know, and it had adhered with the affection that true nicknames carry. He was 18 and had been at Eastmore since he was 14, and he knew this house the way people know places that have shaped them without their consent. He looked at her and she looked at him, and he said, in the way that young men say things they have been carrying around waiting for permission to release, "Are you the new harpist?" "I am." He considered this. "You'll want to know about the music room," he said. "Or rather, you'll want to know what's worth knowing about it, which is that no one plays there. The Duke had it locked 3 years ago. The key's with Mrs. Hatch, and nobody asks for it." "On whose instruction?" Rosund said. "His Grace's." Dawes said it without inflection, as plain fact. "He doesn't care for music. Everyone below stairs knows it. The harp was kept because it was his mother's, not because it's to be played. You'll be given the small saloon. There's an upright that was tuned for Lady Honoria's visit last month. The Duke doesn't come to the saloon. He avoids it. He avoids a great many rooms," Dawes said, with a flat, practical honesty that held no cruelty. "It's a large house. There are more than enough to avoid." He bid her good evening and moved on down the corridor with his lamp, the small circle of light receding around the turn and leaving her in the dark. Rosund stood in the passage. The cold in the slate floor came through the soles of her shoes. From somewhere high in the upper house came the sound of a loose shutter working against its frame in the wind. A sound like a knock that no one intends to answer. She had come here understanding that she would be serving a stranger, that the stranger would be cold or difficult or indifferent. She had anticipated and made her peace with. But this was a different quality of coldness. Not cruelty, not pride, not the blunt incuriosity of men who have never had reason to notice those below them. This was a coldness with a specific direction. A man does not lock a room against music from indifference. He locks it because the music reaches somewhere the lock was built to protect. The whole vast machinery of Eastmore's silence, she understood now, had been arranged in service of a wound she had not yet seen, and would not, if the Duke had ordered it correctly, ever be asked to see. She was back in her room by 10. She lay in the narrow bed with the green shawl folded over the music on the table beside her, the creditor's letter still inside her coat. The house made its nighttime noises around her, the pipe knock of cooling iron, the settle of old timber, a long, low breath through the chimney. Rosund lay still and listened to it the way she had listened, as a child, to her mother settle herself at the keyboard before beginning a piece, attending to the silence before the first note, when a room adjusts itself to receive what is coming. She did not know, lying there, that the Duke's private secretary, Mr. Tibbet, a quiet, pale-eyed man who had served Eastmore for 11 years and noticed things the way still water notices the shapes moving above it, had already written her name in his small leather notebook. She did not know that below that name he had written, in his careful clerk's hand, references impeccable, breeding apparent, inquiry warranted. What Tibbet had begun, and what the Duke did not yet know had been begun, was a question that would take several weeks to answer. She knew only the arithmetic, and the silence, and the tremor in her hands. Outside the window, The stone wall of the north wing disappeared into the dark. Somewhere above her, one of the shuttered rooms of the upper floor held its silence, with what felt, in the particular quality of the night, like effort. What happens in a house, she had written to Edmund, when someone decides to stop listening? She was about to find out. The small saloon sat at the western end of the ground floor, separated from the main reception rooms by a short passage and a pair of doors that were never fully closed but never properly open, held at a permanent half-angle by the slight warp in the floorboards. It received the afternoon light late and reluctantly through two windows whose south-facing aspect had been partially obscured by the growth of an untended climbing rose against the exterior stonework. Nobody had cut it back in at least 2 seasons. The rose's bare November canes pressed against the glass in a pattern that moved when the wind moved, casting thin, shifting shadows across the walls. The upright piano in the small saloon had been tuned the previous month for Lady Honoria Cresswell's visit, and was, in consequence, the most recently serviced instrument in the house. The harp, Rosund's professional instrument, was to arrive by carrier from the Dalton estate within the fortnight, forwarded from her previous engagement. Until then, she had the piano and the small saloon, and the long, grey autumn mornings, which she used as she had always used empty time before a performance. Not by practicing scales, but by sitting in the room until it stopped feeling foreign. On her 3rd day at Eastmore, in the middle of the morning, she played her mother's piece. She had not planned to. She had been running through a set of Italian airs she knew were safe choices for household musicales, light, social, requiring nothing of the listener. And somewhere, in the turn between the 2nd and 3rd, she had simply departed from them. The music moved into the other thing, the thing written in ink that had run slightly at one corner of the page. And Rosund played it, quietly, without ornamentation, as close to the way her mother had hummed it under her breath as she could manage. The room was empty. She believed it to be empty. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was that the Duke had been passing the half-open doors on his way to the library, a route he took each morning at precisely the same hour. A habit so ingrained it had the character of gravity, and had stopped. She did not hear him stop. The music was not loud, and his footfall was not heavy, and the small saloon was arranged in such a way that the piano faced the windows rather than the door, putting her back to anyone in the passage. She played to the end of the piece, sat for a moment in the silence that followed, and then set her hands in her lap. When she turned, the passage was empty. She went back to the Italian airs. Downstairs in the east corridor, the Duke of Eastmore, whose name was Julian Ashford Crane, though the name was rarely spoken aloud in the house except in the most formal business correspondence, stood with one hand on the door of the library and did not immediately go inside. He was 34. He had been 34 since March, and intended, in the way that men who have lost enthusiasm for anniversaries intend things, to continue being 34 in some indefinite internal sense well into the future. He was not an ugly man, nor a particularly handsome one. He had the kind of face that becomes more legible with repeated observation. The features arranged less for immediate impression than for the accumulation of detail over time. His dark coat was well made and quietly expensive, and had a small moth-damage repair at the left cuff that his valet had mended neatly enough that you would only notice it if you were standing close and looking for it. He had not been standing close to many people recently. He went into the library and sat at the desk and looked at the correspondence his secretary had left there for him. He did not read it. He had been carrying, for 8 years, a practice of deliberate not hearing. It had begun at his mother's death, and had been so consistently maintained in the years since that it had become invisible to him. Not an absence he noticed, but simply the shape of how a room sounded. Music at a distance. A carriage passing over cobblestones. A melody heard from a street away. even the particular register of a pianoforte, leaking under a closed door at a dinner party. He had learned to let these sounds arrive and depart without any internal purchase, the way water moves over glass. He was proud of this, in the remote, unsentimental way that people are proud of anything that has cost them enough effort. What had happened in the passage outside the small saloon was that the practice had failed. Not loudly, not catastrophically, not in any way that would be visible to a person watching him. He had stopped walking, that was all. He had stood in the corridor and listened for perhaps 40 seconds and then moved on. But something in those 40 seconds had not moved on with him. The music had not been recognisable, not from any published collection, not from any composer's catalogue he knew. And he knew a reasonably thorough catalogue, because his mother had made sure of it. Had sat with him as a boy, in the very room that was now locked, and shown him the names and histories behind the music she played. This piece had none of those markers. It was someone's private music, written for a room rather than a reputation, and it had arrived through the half-open doors and settled in his chest before he had a chance to prevent it. He picked up the first letter on the pile. The letter was from his solicitor regarding the Eastern farm holdings. He read the first sentence 3 times and could not account for the content. He set it down. On the other side of the desk, the window gave onto the side garden, where the last of the autumn's lavender had collapsed under its own weight and not been cut back. The garden had been his mother's project, not in the sense of labouring over it personally, but in the sense of caring about it, of having opinions about it, of being the reason things were planted in particular arrangements. After her death, it had continued to be tended by a gardener who had been given instructions and received no new ones. It was not a neglected garden. It was a garden following old orders, with no one to countermand them, which is a different, and in some ways more affecting kind of neglect. Julian looked at the collapsed lavender for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and went to find Mr. Tibbet. Tibbet's office was a small room off the main corridor, north-facing, very tidy, warmed by a stove rather than a fireplace, because Tibbet had specific opinions about the superiority of consistent heat over radiant heat, and the late Duke had permitted this opinion, and the current Duke had inherited the arrangement without examining it. Tibbet himself was at his desk when Julian entered, already present, always at his desk, as if he had been created for the room rather than choosing to occupy it. He was perhaps 50, thin-shouldered, with the pale, watchful eyes of a man who has spent decades reading rooms as well as documents, and a leather notebook on the desk before him that he closed as Julian entered without appearing to hurry. "The new harpist," Julian said, without preamble. "She arrived this week." "Tuesday evening," Tibbet confirmed. "Her references are from the Dalton household in Essex. Impeccable, in the conventional sense." "In the conventional sense," Julian repeated. "She is a gentleman's daughter." Tibbet said it the way he said facts that had additional implications, which was without additional inflection. "The father died 2 years ago. There are no obvious encumbrances of record, but I have made an inquiry and I expect a reply within a fortnight." Julian looked at him steadily. "I didn't ask you to make an inquiry." "No," Tibbet said, "you did not." He offered nothing further, and his expression suggested that the absence of an instruction had not functioned in this instance as a prohibition. Julian sat in the chair beside the desk, not behind it, as he would have in his own study, but beside it, in the way that indicated he had come for conversation rather than business. He was not entirely sure why he had come. Tibbet waited with his customary patient absence of impatience. What piece was she playing? Julian asked. There was a brief silence. Then Tibbet said, carefully, I'm afraid I couldn't say, Your Grace. I was not in that part of the house this morning. It had no publisher's mark to it, not a conservatory piece. He was not asking. He was following a thought aloud, which he did not often do in Tibbet's company, and recognized as he did it that the recognition itself was information. Someone wrote it for private use. That would be consistent with what little I have established, Tibbet said. He paused, then added, Her mother, I believe, was the musician of the family. Julian said nothing. He looked at the stove. It had been 8 years since anyone had played music in this house, with the particular quality of privacy. Music played not for an audience, but for the room itself, for the player's own private reasons. He had forgotten that this quality was distinct from other kinds of playing, until this morning, when he had heard it from the corridor, and his body had recalled it before his mind was prepared to. His mother had played that way. In the locked room, in the hour between dusk and dinner, when she believed no one was listening, though Julian, at 12 and 14 and 16, had always been listening from the passage. Sitting on the floor, with his back against the wainscot, he stood. The inquiry, he said to Tibbet. When you have the reply, bring it to me before you act on it. Tibbet inclined his head. Julian left. He did not, this time, pass through the western corridor on his way back. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, the household arranged itself around a different kind of event. The annual pre-winter visit of Lady Honoria Cresswell, who arrived at the front entrance by private carriage at 11 o'clock, preceded by her maid with 2 hat boxes, and followed by a footman with 3 pieces of luggage, and the particular air of a man who has carried those 3 pieces of luggage on many previous occasions and has made his peace with it. Lady Honoria was 26, the daughter of a baronet, and possessed of the kind of beauty that had been carefully managed since adolescence, to ensure it was never in competition with anything she required it to support. She played the pianoforte with technical correctness and considerable personal satisfaction. She had been, for the better part of the past year, conducting what she and her mother referred to privately as a campaign, and what the Eastmore household recognised without naming as an inevitable arrangement, a recognition that Lady Honoria herself had been instrumental in producing. She moved through the front hall with the ease of a woman who has rehearsed a room until it conforms to her, and greeted Julian in the drawing room with the warmth of a person who has strategically banked warmth for deployment at the precise right moment. Julian greeted her with courtesy, offered tea, and managed, through long practice, to appear as if his mind were entirely present in the conversation, when in fact it was doing what it had been doing since that Friday morning in the passage outside the small saloon, returning, without his instruction, to a specific 40 seconds of sound. In the drawing room that afternoon, while the tea things were still on the table, the conversation turned, as it reliably did in Lady Honoria's vicinity, to music. She played, after a short interval of encouragement, a set of pieces by Clementi, which were precisely as good as her practice schedule warranted, accurate, well-tempered, adequate. Julian listened with the expression he used for music since his mother's death, which was the expression of a man attending to something he is determined not to be altered by. Honoria finished the set and turned on the bench with the trained grace of a woman who has made turning on a piano bench into something memorable. I hear, she said, that you have a new harpist. She arrived this week, Julian said. I should like to hear her play. The pleasantness in her voice was quite exact, warm enough to seem like curiosity, but with a precision underneath it that was something other than curiosity. One hears such different standards among itinerant musicians. It can be difficult to know quite what one is getting. Julian set his tea down. She is engaged on a professional reference from a well-regarded household, he said. I have no complaints. Of course, said Lady Honoria, and smiled in the particular way that closes a subject while leaving the door ajar. Across the house, in the small saloon, Rosund had been playing for 2 hours without stopping. Not to perform, not to demonstrate, but to tire out the arithmetic. There was a version of the sums that worked if Edmund received his response from Whitehall before Christmas, and she had been building it in her head alongside the music. The two things running in parallel, each one offering the other a kind of cover. The rose canes tapped against the glass. The afternoon light had gone grey. She did not know that Lady Honoria had arrived. She did not know that Lady Honoria, on her way to her appointed rooms upstairs, had paused in the passage outside the small saloon. Perhaps for 30 seconds, perhaps for longer, and listened to the piece without a name through the half-open door. She did not know that Lady Honoria, on resuming her walk upstairs, had her face arranged in a particular careful way, that her maid, a young woman named Agnes, who had been with her 4 years, recognised as the expression that preceded a decision. Agnes, who was not unintelligent and not unobservant, made her own calculation as she followed her mistress up the stairs, and kept it to herself. The next morning, a grey Saturday, with the first real cold of the season settling across the estate, Julian was in the corridor outside the library at his usual hour, when he heard the music again. He stopped. He was aware that he had stopped this time before the music registered, as if his body had marked the location from the last occasion and was waiting, without his knowledge, for the possibility to repeat. The piece was not his mother's. It was not any published piece. It was the same music as the week before, played in the same private, unaddressed way. And it came through the half-open doors of the small saloon with the quality of something not meant to be heard. He stood in the corridor for longer this time, long enough that a footman passed at the far end of the passage, and Julian did not move. And the footman discreetly changed his route. When the piece ended and the silence returned, Julian waited 3 further seconds, then walked to the saloon door. He knocked once on the open door, lightly. The sound at the piano bench stopped. Rosund turned. The morning light from the windows was behind him, and for a moment she saw only the outline of a tall man in a dark coat, standing in the doorway of a room that, she had been told, he did not enter. She rose from the bench and gave the small, respectful inclination appropriate to a hired musician in the presence of the head of household. Neither of them spoke immediately. He was looking at her with an expression she could not categorize. Not displeasure, not the assessing appraisal of an employer inspecting new staff. It was the expression of a man who is looking at the source of something that arrived before its source did, and is not yet sure what to do with the correspondence. He said, "What was that piece called?" Rosund looked at him directly. "It has no name, Your Grace. It is only my mother's." The answer arrived in the room and sat there. He had been prepared, in the way that people prepare for answers they expect, for a title and a composer's name. The preparation dissolved. He looked at her, at the worn black cotton of her working dress, at the green shawl that had been folded over the music stand, and which he touched now briefly with one hand, as if confirming something, and said nothing further for a moment that extended past the length of polite conversation. "She composed it herself," he said. "At an evening table, with the curtains drawn," Rosund said. "I watched her write it out. I was 7. She hummed as she worked, to check the sound. Something in his posture, the particular stillness of a man standing in a place he has told himself he does not come, shifted very slightly. It was not relaxation, and it was not softening. and it did not resolve into anything she could name. He looked at the green shawl on the music stand for one more second. Then he said, "Carry on," and walked away down the corridor. Rosund stood at the piano for a moment after the sound of his steps had faded. Her hands were at her sides, quite still. Then she sat back down at the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, and did not, for a long time, play anything at all. In the east corridor, Julian walked toward the library with the particular stride of a man who has decided on a direction and intends to maintain it regardless of what the interior is doing. He entered the library, closed the door, and stood before the window, looking out at the collapsed lavender in the side garden. He had spent 8 years seeing Lady Honoria and registering each time the appropriate categories: accomplished, suitable, present. This morning, for the first time, he understood that he had not been seeing her at all. He had been looking in her direction and seeing the shape of a decision that needed eventually to be made, which is not the same thing as seeing a person. It is only my mother's. He looked at the lavender for a long time. Then he sat at the desk and wrote a brief instruction to the gardener, the first new instruction the garden had received in 8 years, asking that the collapsed stems be cut back before the first frost. He did not examine why he had done this. He sent the note with a footman, opened the solicitor's letter, and read it through for the first time properly. Tibbet, entering an hour later with a packet of correspondence requiring signature, found him at the desk in an attitude of genuine attention that the secretary had not observed in a considerable time, and noted this in his private way without remark, as he noted most things worth remembering. The harp arrived on a Thursday, lashed to the back of a carrier's wagon with padded felt and 2 lengths of leather strap. It came from the Dalton estate, by a route that took 3 days and had evidently involved at least 1 river crossing in uncertain weather, because the case, a long cedar box with brass fittings, the property of the Dalton household but lent for transport, had a watermark along its lower edge that had not been there when Rosund last saw it. The instrument itself was unharmed. She checked each string in sequence before she checked anything else, running her thumb up the column from the lowest bass note, her ear close to the soundboard, cataloguing the particular voice of each one. The 3rd octave had gone slightly flat from the cold. Doors and a second footman carried the case in through the side entrance and set it in the small saloon with the careful deference that the English male extends to any object that is clearly both heavy and breakable. Rosund thanked them without looking up from the soundboard. Mrs. Hatch appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who has overseen the arrival of many objects and can classify them by category at a glance, and withdrew without comment. Rosund spent the next hour tuning. The harp was not the late Duchess's harp. That instrument remained in the locked music room above, in whatever condition 8 years of disuse had left it. Rosund's harp was her own professional instrument, a concert pedal harp, 47 strings, the gilded column at its neck carved with a running acanthus pattern that had lost much of its original gilding and acquired instead the particular warm patina of a thing used hard and used well for many years. The lowest note, when she struck it, resonated in the floorboards. She had owned it since she was 17, purchased with money her father had specifically set aside for the purpose, calling it an investment in the one vocational skill the family possessed. She played for an hour after the tuning, alone, and said nothing to anyone about how much it mattered to have the instrument back. By the end of the first week of November, Eastmore had begun, in small and nearly imperceptible ways, to change. Not at Rosund's instruction. She had no authority to instruct anyone in the management of the house, and she was under no illusion that she would have been tolerated if she'd tried. She worked by a different method. She noticed and she asked. And she offered the asking in the specific register of someone who might easily be told no and will not be offended by it. When she observed that the small table in the drawing room sat at such an angle that the Duke, who spent his evenings there with a book and a lamp, was always reading at the edge of the light rather than the centre of it. She mentioned to Dawes one morning whether the table might possibly be moved 3 feet toward the fire. She did not say it was for the Duke. She said only that it seemed a better arrangement for the room. Dawes moved it that afternoon without comment. When she discovered, through the ordinary geography of the household, that there was a glass and iron cold house attached to the eastern kitchen garden, containing several forcing beds of narcissi in various stages of bloom, flowers that had been grown by the late Duchess's standing instruction and continued to be grown by a gardener named Pollard, who had never received instructions to stop, she asked Mrs. Hatch whether she thought the Duke's study might benefit from a vase. Mrs. Hatch looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a woman conducting several calculations simultaneously. Then she said, 2 stems, and went to find Pollard herself. Julian noticed the narcissi on a Tuesday morning. He stood at his desk for a moment looking at the vase, a plain white porcelain one, nothing extravagant, with the stillness of a man encountering something familiar in an unexpected location. He did not say anything to Tibbet, who was present. Tibbet did not say anything either, which was its own form of commentary. The third small change was the one Rosund had not planned. She had been teaching herself the house's rhythms, as she always did in a new engagement, by paying attention to who went where and when. Mary, the kitchen maid, a girl of 15, small and fine-boned, with dark hair cut close, and a stillness so complete it had initially struck Rosund as vacancy before she understood it as something more carefully chosen, passed the small saloon door every morning at 9:30, on her way between the kitchen and the laundry. She always slowed at the door if Rosund was playing. Rosund had noticed this for several days before she did anything about it. Mary was mute. She had been mute since birth, not death, Mrs. Hatch had clarified when Rosund asked. And the distinction mattered. She heard everything and understood everything, and communicated through the household by a private language of gestures that the longer-serving staff had learned to read, and the newer ones were still deciphering. She had been at Eastmore since she was 12, brought by a cousin who worked in the still room and later left. And she had never, in 3 years, been in the same room as a harp being properly played. On a Friday morning, Rosund stopped at the door of the small saloon as Mary was passing and said simply, "Would you like to come in?" Mary looked at her. Then she came in. She sat on the chair beside the window, very upright, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between Rosund's hands and Rosund's face with an intensity of attention that had nothing appraising in it. She was not evaluating the performance, she was receiving it. The way people receive things they had not known they were waiting for. Rosund played a country air, a folk tune her father had been fond of, something without pretension or complication. When she finished, the silence in the room held a different quality. Then she said, "Give me your hand." Mary offered her right hand, watching. Rosund placed it on the soundboard of the harp. Then she played the same tune again, very softly. The vibration moved through the wood into Mary's palm, and Rosund watched the girl's face undergo a small, private transformation. Not a dramatic response, not tears, not the performed wonder that people produce when they know they are observed having a feeling. Just a slight change in the set of her mouth, a loosening, as if the face had been holding something for a long time and had just found the location to put it down. After that, Mary came to the saloon on most mornings, sitting in the chair by the window for whatever time she could spare from the kitchen. Rosund taught her, patiently, through demonstration and placement of the hands rather than instruction, a simple alternating chord pattern in the bass. She was a quick learner. She was also, Rosund suspected, accustomed to learning things that no one expected her to need. Dawes watched this arrangement develop with the quiet approval of a young man who has seen something good happen in a house that he cares about more than he is likely to admit. He mentioned it to no one of consequence. It was not, he had learned, the kind of thing that benefited from mention. It was Dawes who opened the shutters in the morning room. Rosund had asked him quietly, on the 9th of November, whether there was a particular reason the shutters in the room at the end of the northeast corridor were kept closed. He had said, carefully, that the room had not been in regular use for some years, and that no specific instruction had been given to keep it shut, only that no instruction had been given to open it. There was a difference, he had said, and she had recognised in this formulation a version of the distinction Mrs. Hatch had offered her on the first night. Between unhappy and quiet, between locked and simply closed. She said, "The light from that corridor is the best in the house, and if the shutters were open for even an hour in the morning, it might improve the whole passage." Dawes considered this. Then he said he supposed he could see to it. He opened them on a Wednesday, in the first hour of clear light that November had offered. The shutters were wooden, painted grey, and they had been closed long enough that they required some persuasion before they swung back on their hinges. The light came through the east-facing windows in a flat, cold, precise angle, the particular quality of late autumn morning light, which carries no warmth but a great deal of clarity. It fell directly on the portrait. Rosund had not known the portrait was there. It hung on the east wall between the two windows. A large canvas in a plain gilt frame, the only portrait in the room, which was otherwise furnished as a comfortable sitting room that had simply stopped being used rather than been formally closed. A woman in a pale dress, seated, one hand resting on the arm of a chair. The face was not beautiful in the conventional arrangement of features. It was attentive, warm, inhabited by a quality that painters sometimes struggled to catch, and this painter had managed. The eyes were dark. The mouth was arranged in the expression that precedes a smile rather than the smile itself. Rosund stood before it for several minutes. She was still standing there when she heard a step in the doorway. She had not heard him approach. She turned, and Julian was standing in the entrance to the morning room, with the expression of a man who had been walking past a room and found the door open and the light on when the room had been dark for years. He was looking not at Rosund, but at the portrait. His face was not readable in the way that faces usually are, not because it was closed, but because it was doing too many things at once. Rosund took a step back, intending to excuse herself. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly and not sharply. He said it in the tone of a man who has reached the end of a very long act of prevention and has simply stopped. He came into the room. He stood beside her, a few feet distant, looking at the portrait. His hands were at his sides, very still. She understood, without needing it said, what this was. She said nothing and did not move, which was the right thing, and she knew it was the right thing. Not because she had calculated it, but because the room asked for it. She sat for it the summer before she died, Julian said. His voice had the quality of a thing said aloud, for the first time, after being carried inside for a long time. Not strained, but carrying the particular density of long-stored material. The painter was a young man from the village, who had never painted anyone of consequence before, and was visibly terrified of her, which she found extremely funny. She spent the entire first session trying to keep her face composed, and failing. He was so frightened of offending her that he couldn't bring himself to say when she was moving. A pause. She said it was the most enjoyable afternoon she'd spent in years. Rosund looked at the mouth in the portrait, the expression that preceded a smile. He caught it, she said, the almost smile. "It's the only likeness that does," Julian said. "The others are formal." She disliked formality in small rooms. He looked at the portrait for a further moment in silence. Then he said, with a quietness that suggested the admission cost something, but not as much as he had expected, "I had forgotten the light comes through this window in the morning." Rosund turned slightly to look at the angle of the light, the cold, clarifying eastern light that had made the portrait's features legible from across the room. "It's a good window," she said. "It was her favourite room in winter," Julian said. "She said it was the only room in the house that didn't try to be grand." He stopped. He appeared, briefly, to notice that he had been speaking, to take stock of the quantity of what had just come out of him, with no distress but with a small, private acknowledgement. He looked at the window rather than the portrait. The cold house narcissi in the study, the table moved 3 feet toward the fire. The shutters opened. The morning room with the best light in the house. Rosund had not known when she asked doors to open the shutters what would happen, but she had been listening to the house the way she listened to a room before playing, attending to what it needed, not what it was performing. She picked up her shawl from the windowsill where she had set it down while looking at the portrait, the green wool, unmistakable, and folded it over her arm. "I'll leave you the room," she said. "No," he said it as simply as before. Then he said, "Stay a moment," which was not a command and not a request. It was the particular formulation of a man to whom asking does not come easily, addressing someone for whose company he finds he does not have the proper vocabulary yet. She stayed. They stood side by side before the portrait of his mother in the morning light, the silence between them the companionable kind, the kind that a room grants to people who are both, for different reasons, accustomed to being alone in it. After a few minutes, he said quietly, "She would have liked to hear you play." Rosund looked at the portrait's eyes, dark, attentive, holding their indefinite mirth. She said carefully, "I'll play for her, if you like." Julian said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Perhaps," and left the room at a measured pace that did not suggest retreat, though she knew it was one, and a necessary one, and that it was not retreat from her. She stood in the morning light with the portrait for a few minutes longer. By the time she returned to the small saloon and sat at the harp, the house around her had the quality she had noticed in the very first days at Eastmore. A large, profound silence. But it was a different silence now. Not the silence of a place that has decided to stop listening. Something older and less voluntary. The silence of a space that is waiting for permission to become a room again. In his East Wing study, Julian sat at his desk with a letter from Tibbet open before him. He had told the secretary to bring in the inquiry results before acting, and Tibbet had done so. The reply had come from a solicitor in Suffolk, and it confirmed the father's death and the estate's dissolution. And one further fact that Tibbet had underlined in his careful, undemonstrative way. A brother, Edmund Renham, currently seeking a military commission with a debt to a private moneylender registered in London under the name of a firm Julian recognised as belonging to the least scrupulous end of that particular trade. Julian read the underlined line twice. He set the letter face down on the desk and looked at the wall. He now knew something that Rosund had not told him. He did not yet know why she had not told him, or whether the silence was pride, or strategy, or simple calculation. He knew only the fact and the question that followed it, which was, what does a person in that position do with a situation like this one? And how much of what she is doing in this house is the answer to that question? He turned the letter face down again and stared at the wall for a long time, which was not the same as not thinking about it. He did ask her to play in the morning room. He did not phrase it as a request, and he did not phrase it as an instruction. He found her in the corridor on the Thursday after the portrait morning and said, simply, "When you have an hour," which was less a statement of condition than an acknowledgement that she had obligations he would not override, and that he was aware of the distinction between those two things. She said she had an hour now. He held the morning room door open and stepped back to let her pass. She brought the harp. Dawes and the second footman carried it between them, somewhat ceremonially, and set it in the north window embrasure where the light was best and where the resonance from the stone wall would carry cleanly without echoing off the close angles of a smaller space. Julian sat in the chair nearest the portrait, not directly facing it, but at the angle of a man who might look at it if he chose and might also look at the room. She played her mother's piece. It was the third time he had heard it, and each time it had arrived differently. In the corridor, it had come as an intrusion, finding him before he could prepare. In the small saloon on the morning he knocked, it had been present in the air like something already finished. Here, in the room his mother had called the only room in the house that didn't try to be grand, with the portrait watching from the east wall and the late autumn garden pale through the windows, it landed in a way he had no word for. Not grief, exactly, and not comfort, and not the domestic warmth of a memory recovered. Something that stood between all of those and was therefore its own thing. He sat for the duration of the piece with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely linked, and when it ended, he did not speak immediately, and Rosund did not prompt him. After a while, he said, "She would have argued with the middle section." Rosund looked at him. "Too resolved," he said. "She liked unresolved intervals. She had a theory that music which knew where it was going too early wasted the best part of the journey." A pause. She expressed this opinion at some length to her own pianoforte teacher, who was 72 and had been playing for 60 years and was not accustomed to having his authority questioned by a girl of 19. "Who won the argument?" Rosund asked. "She did," Julian said. "She generally did." He looked at the portrait briefly, then at the window. She was not unkind about it. That was the difficulty. You couldn't be properly aggrieved, because she argued so cheerfully. This was more than he had said aloud about his mother in 8 years, not counting the story of the painter, and he knew it, and did not appear to regret it. He looked at the angle of the light for a moment, then stood in the unhurried way of a man who has finished what he came for and is comfortable with that fact. "Thank you," he said, to Rosund, which was the first time he had used the word to her directly. She held it in the ordinary way you hold something unexpected, not drawing attention to it, but not putting it down either. He left. She sat with the harp for a few minutes, her palms resting on the strings to still them, the last vibration of the room settling into the walls. And she was aware of a feeling she could not afford, and did not yet have a name for, that had been growing in the weeks since her arrival, with the steady, unremarked inevitability of a forcing bed in the cold house. Something pressing upward toward light, in the dark, without being asked. She set it aside. She had arithmetic to do. What Rosund did not know, in those early November weeks at Eastmore, was the specific shape of what Lady Honoria was assembling. Honoria had been watching. She had watched with the focused, unobjective attention of someone who understands that information precedes action, and who has learned to collect information with the patience of a card player building a hand. She had watched Julian's posture alter by small degrees. She had watched the narcissi appear in the study. She had watched the shutters open in the morning room and known, without being told, what that signified. Because she had tried twice in 3 seasons to suggest that the morning room be opened, and had been met each time with a polite, absolute silence. She had her own private intelligence of the household's changed movements. A word from Agnes, a detail from a footman who was not doors, and she assembled these the way a surveyor assembles the outline of a property. Methodically, without sentiment, toward a practical conclusion. The letter arrived from London on a Wednesday morning, delivered with the household post to the silver tray in the front hall. This is what Honoria knew, and when. She had known since the previous month through Tibbitt's early inquiry results reaching her by a route she had cultivated through a contact in the solicitor's office in Suffolk, that Rosund Renham was a gentleman's daughter with a brother and a debt. She had known the broad outline. What she did not yet know was the specific figures, the specific moneylender, the specific terms, the operational detail that would transform a vague vulnerability into a targeted one. Edmund's letter supplied it. It was in his handwriting, which was hurried and slightly large, with the slanted descenders of a man who had learned to write quickly and never entirely unlearned the habit. The outer fold was sealed with plain red wax, no crest. It was addressed to Miss R. Renham, Eastmore House, and it arrived among several pieces of household correspondence in the morning delivery, and it sat on the tray for perhaps 20 minutes. Honoria had been passing through the front hall on her way to the library. She was not in the habit of reading other people's correspondence, as a general principle. She was, however, in the habit of recognizing the moment when a general principle becomes less useful than a specific piece of knowledge. She took the letter. She read it in her room, alone, with the door closed. She replaced it in the original fold, as close to its original condition as possible, and returned it to the tray 25 minutes after she had taken it. The wax had already been broken by the journey, and required no additional damage. Edmund's letter informed his sister. Honoria now knew that the money-lending firm of Haskell & Vane required £61 by the 23rd of December, and that if the sum was not met, the matter would be referred to a court agent. He had signed it with his full name, and added a postscript that said simply, "I am sorry it has grown. I did not plan for it to grow." Below this, he had drawn a small crooked star, the kind of private symbol that belongs to a correspondence rather than a composition, meaningful only between two people. Honoria looked at the postscript for a moment, then she folded the letter and left the room. She used the information 11 days later at the Partridge dinner. Mr. Gerald Partridge kept a comfortable old farmhouse 3 miles north of Eastmore, which he had expanded, over a decade of modest prosperity, into something that fell in the social register between a working farm and a gentleman's house. He was 45, broad-chested, with a red face that managed to appear both genial and alert. The face of a man who is genuinely sociable and genuinely enjoys news, and who has never quite separated these two pleasures from one another. His dinners were well attended. His discretion was imperfect. These two facts, from Honoria's perspective, constituted a professional qualification. She sat beside him at the table. The guests that evening included the Marsdens from the neighbouring estate, a visiting clergyman and his wife, and the 2 Miss Denhams from the village, a total of 12 people. The specific social density that allowed a word dropped in one direction to travel naturally around a table without any single speaker appearing to have intended its circulation. She waited until the soup had been cleared and the second course was establishing itself. Then she said, in the tone of someone sharing something regrettable, rather than deploying something useful, "I am told the Duke's new harpist is very accomplished." She paused. "Though I confess I am troubled by certain things I've heard, and I am not sure how much to credit them." Partridge was immediately, visibly attentive. What she offered him was not a lie in the technical sense. It was the particular kind of construction that truth makes possible when you arrange its elements in the wrong order. That Rosund had debts, that the debts involved men of business, that she had been seen in correspondence, late at night, private correspondence with tradesmen, it was remarked upon. And that the specifics were, Honoria said carefully, something she preferred not to know more about. She capped this with a perfectly genuine note of generosity. The girl was very talented, and one hoped for the best, and whatever the circumstances of her private arrangements were, they need not reflect on her as a musician. She said all of this clearly enough that it could be repeated, and murkily enough that in the repetition it would only grow murkier. Partridge nodded, in the manner of someone filling an internal form. The clergyman's wife had been listening and was now examining her fish with heightened attention. One of the Miss Denhams glanced at the other. By the end of the following week, the versions circulating among the local gentry had moved some distance from Honoria's original formulation. It had acquired in transit the specific vocabulary that rumours acquire when they pass through enough people who have not been given enough information. That Rosund was not merely in debt, but was paying her debts in a manner unsuitable to her claimed station. The word company was used, in the pointed, freighted way that it can be used. Nobody said the worst thing plainly. Nobody needed to. The version that reached Eastmore came through Agnes, Honoria's maid, who carried it into the servants' hall not as gossip, but as concern, which is the social register in which the most damaging gossip travels fastest. It reached Dawes on a Friday evening, and he made the mistake that any young man of 18 with a genuine affection for fair dealing might make. He went to Rosund directly and told her. He had not, in doing this, violated any explicit instruction. He had violated Honoria's implicit calculation, which was that the rumour should arrive everywhere except Rosund's own ears before the ball, so that she would be the last person in the room to know what everyone already thought of her. What Dawes had done, without realising he had done it, was break the containment. Honoria found out within a day. Agnes had told her, as Agnes generally told her everything, in the quiet and immediate way of a woman who understood her position and its requirements and moved to deal with it. The household was told that Dawes had been carrying unauthorised private correspondence between a member of the domestic staff and an outside party, and that this constituted a dismissible offence. The charge was not entirely false. He had, at Rosund's request some weeks earlier, posted one of her letters to Edmund on a morning when she couldn't reach the front hall table before the post had gone. The specific letter cited, however, was not that letter. The timing and the framing were Honoria's, and they were precise. Rosund learned of the dismissal on a Saturday morning from Mrs. Hatch, who delivered the fact with the expressionless delivery of a woman who has been given an instruction she does not endorse and will carry out regardless. She stood in the corridor outside the housekeeper's room for a moment after Mrs. Hatch went back inside. Then she went directly to the east wing. She had not intended to go to Lady Honoria. She had considered it and dismissed it on the reasoning that Honoria would hear any defence Rosund made as confirmation of the charge's relevance. She had considered going to Julian. This option she held for a further moment before the arithmetic of the situation made clear why it was not yet possible. She needed, before she went to Julian, to know exactly what he was being asked to weigh. She went to Lady Tryphena. Lady Tryphena Ashcroft was 61, a widow, and had been a friend of the late Duchess of Eastmore since they were girls of 14, attending the same Bath assembly. She had known Julian since infancy. She arrived each year in November for 3 weeks, occupying the south guest rooms that she had occupied every November for the past 30 years, and she moved through Eastmore with the unhurried authority of someone who knows a house better than most of its current inhabitants and has earned the right to speak in it. She was in the south sitting room with her embroidery when Rosund knocked. She set the embroidery down and looked at Rosund with the particular quality of attention that experienced women extend to younger ones who have arrived in their rooms carrying something they haven't yet found the words for. Rosund told her about Dawes. Not about the rumour, not about Edmund, not about the debt. Only about Dawes. That he had acted in good faith, that the infraction attributed to him was a construction, and that his position should not be forfeited for it. Lady Tryphena listened without interruption. She had a piece of embroidery silk in her hands, deep blue, wound around a small ivory bobbin, and she turned the bobbin slowly throughout, a gesture not of inattention, but of the kind of steady, habitual motion that helps a mind move. You have not come here about the footman, Lady Tryphena said when Rosund finished. Rosund looked at her hands. Sit down, child, Lady Tryphena said. She said it in the manner of the late Duchess, directly, without condescension, with an implication of warmth that did not require performance. Rosund sat. What Lady Tryphena told her next she offered without preamble, because she had no patience for the long approaches to difficult subjects, and because she understood that the only mercy in certain conversations is to deliver them quickly. She had heard the rumour herself, from the clergyman's wife at the Partridges the previous Sunday, and she had known it for what it was, not from any specific knowledge of Rosund's affairs, but from 61 years of watching such constructions and recognising their authorship. The bobbin turned in her hands. She said, "You have a brother?" Rosund said, "Yes." "In some difficulty?" "It is being resolved." "I believe you," Lady Tryphena said. "Lady Honoria does not intend for it to remain unannounced." She looked at Rosund steadily. "She is waiting for the ball. The language she's using now is carefully pitched. Enough to travel, not enough to be directly attributed. The ball will give her an audience and an occasion, and the specific cover of public social form, which makes a cruelty look like a disclosure." She paused. "The Duke must know the whole truth before the ball. From you, not from a room full of people who have been prepared to hear the worst version of it." Rosund sat with this. The ivory bobbin turned in Lady Tryphena's hands, the blue silk catching the lamplight. She had known since the moment Dawes came to her on Friday evening, white-faced and apologetic, that the interval was closing. She had run the arithmetic 100 times in the weeks at Eastmore, in the margins of letters and in the quiet passages before sleep, and she had always arrived at the same figure. There was a version in which the debt was met, the commission secured, and the position at Eastmore concluded honourably, with no one the wiser for any of it. 3 months had been enough time for that version to remain possible. What Honoria had done was not eliminate the version. The debt was still the debt, the commission still required, but to ensure that the version's remaining possibility depended now on a conversation Rosund had been very precisely working not to have. She had not told Julian. She had not told him because she understood, with a clarity that had nothing sentimental in it, what it would look like. A woman of reduced means, in a great man's employ, with a debt and a dependent brother and an ulterior need. She had understood from the first evening, from Dawes's plain account of the locked room and the closed house and the history of carefully maintained silence, that to ask anything of this man would be to become a demand placed upon a person who had been made small by loss, and she would not do it. But there is a difference between choosing not to ask and being in a position where not asking has become indistinguishable from concealment. And Honoria had closed that distance with considerable skill. The blue bobbin came to rest in Lady Tryphena's palm. "Will you speak to him?" she asked. The ball was in 11 days. Rosund looked at the far wall of the south sitting room, where a small watercolour of the Eastmore grounds hung in a plain frame. The estate as it had looked perhaps 20 years ago. The morning room shutters open, the lavender in the side garden at full summer height. It was a picture of the house before it closed. "Yes," she said. "I will speak to him. But not how, and not when, and not what she would say. Because there was no version of the telling that she could build in her head that did not feel like surrendering the only thing she had managed in 6 weeks at Eastmore to keep completely her own. The fact that what had grown in her toward Julian Crane had grown without calculation, without strategy, without the slightest contribution from necessity. She had not intended it, she had not used it. And once she spoke, she would never be able to prove, not to him, and perhaps not to herself, that this was still true. She left Lady Tryphina's room and walked back through the house, which was silent around her in the particular late afternoon way, the lamps not yet lit, the grey November light flattening everything to the same quiet tone. Somewhere above her, in the locked room at the end of the upper corridor, the late Duchess's harp stood in whatever darkness 8 years had made of it. From the small saloon, faint as anything, came the sound of Mary playing her bass chord pattern alone. Slow, deliberate, feeling her way through it in the half-dark, learning the shape of the thing by touch. 11 days. She did not speak to him the next morning. She had intended to, had rehearsed the shape of it, not the words but the order, the sequence of facts set down plain and without appeal, the kind of telling that asks for nothing and therefore cannot be refused. She knew by now the hour he left the library, the route he took to the east garden when the morning was clear, the particular silence of the house at 10 o'clock, when Tibbet was occupied with correspondence and the domestic staff had moved to the upper floors. She had the knowledge and the occasion, and she did not go. She told herself it was because the occasion was not right. And this was not entirely a lie, because there is a quality of rightness to certain conversations that is not sentiment, but logistics. And she understood logistics. But she also knew, in the way that one knows things one would prefer not to examine, that what she was waiting for was not the right occasion, but the right version of herself. The one who could deliver the facts without the tremor in her hands giving something away. She spent the morning at the harp. The Tuesday before the ball, Julian found her himself. He came to the small saloon just after 10, knocked once on the open door as he had done before, and entered without waiting for an answer. Not in the manner of a man asserting authority, but in the manner of someone who has been moving toward a destination for a certain number of weeks and has finally arrived at it. He was carrying a book. He set it on the side table, sat in the chair beside the window, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you told me. Your mother." She lowered her hands from the strings. What specifically? That she wrote the piece for the room. He looked at the window rather than at her. Not for an audience, not to be heard by anyone in particular. He paused. My mother played the same way. I used to sit in the passage outside and listen. She knew, I think. She must have known. But she never said so. She played as if I weren't there, which was a kindness. It gave me permission to hear it without becoming part of it. Rosund was quiet. I understand now, he said, that I have been doing something similar with you. The room held this. Outside, the bare rose canes moved against the glass. He was looking at her now. Not with the assessing reserve she had catalogued in the early weeks, not with the careful administration of distance. He was looking at her the way a person looks when they have stopped managing the act of looking. He said, I need to tell you what Tibbet found. And here was the thing she had not anticipated. He already knew. He had known since the letter from the Suffolk solicitor, and he had not acted on it, and he had not treated her differently, and he had sat in the morning room while she played his mother's music, and never once let the knowledge enter the room between them. She understood, in the moment he said it, that he had been protecting the same thing she had been protecting. The growing thing, the clean thing. By holding the knowledge apart from it, and letting the two exist separately for as long as they could. He told her what Tibbet had established. The names, the figures, the December deadline. He said them plainly, in the way of a man setting down something heavy so that both people can see it properly. And he watched her face. She said, "You have known since November." "Since the 9th, he said. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I need you to know that I chose to tell you, not that I was cornered into it." She said it without heat, without defence, as fact. The way she had delivered the fact about her mother's music on the morning he knocked. "It is only my mother's." Julian was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference," he said. "I have watched you for 6 weeks. I know what you do when you are calculating, and I know what you do when you are not." He looked at his hands. "You are not calculating now." She looked at the green shawl on the music stand. "No," she said, "not now." He said, "Then let me ask you something plainly." He waited, not for permission, but for the particular quality of stillness in the room that makes plain questions possible. Would you have stayed if the debt were resolved, if Edmund had his commission, if there were no arithmetic? Would you have found a reason to stay? The answer came without deliberation, which was itself the answer. "Yes," she said. He stood. He crossed the room to the harp in 2 unhurried strides. Not to the harp exactly, but to her. Standing before her with the specific proximity of a man who has decided the remaining distance is no longer worth the distance. His face at this range was the fully legible version of itself, the features assembled at last for immediate impression rather than accumulated observation. He said, quietly, "Then stay." This was not a proposal, it was not a declaration, it was something that preceded both. The private version of a thing that would need, in the days that followed, a public version too, and both of them knew it. But here, in the small saloon, with the rose canes brushing the glass and the harp strings still faintly resonant from the last note she had played, it was sufficient. It was, in fact, everything. She said, "There are things people in this county believe about me. You should know them before—" She stopped. "I know them," Julian said. "Tibbet hears everything. What I know about what Lady Honoria has been doing, I have known for a week." His voice did not harden when he said the name. It did not need to. He simply said it the way one names an obstacle one intends to go around rather than into. "I intend to deal with it, but I wanted to hear you first." She looked at him. "The ball is in 9 days. "Yes," he said, "she is planning to speak there." "I know that too." "And?" He looked at her steadily. "And I intend to speak first." What he had not said, not because he was withholding it, but because the category of people who say certain things only once had claimed him long ago, was what he intended to say. She could have asked. She did not ask. She looked at his face, at the patience that lived there, like something that had cost enormously to build and was now very strong, and found that she did not need the words in advance. There was a silence. Then he picked up the book from the side table. He had brought it, she saw now, not as a prop or as distraction, but for a specific purpose, and set it in her hands. It was a slim volume, old, the spine cracked along the bottom half from long use. A collection of Scottish airs, the title page printed in Edinburgh in 1791. Inside the front cover, in a woman's handwriting, not a young woman's, the hand of someone middle-aged and assured, was an annotation. For the room, not the audience. Rosund read the inscription twice. "It was hers," Julian said. "I thought it should have a use." He left. She held the small book in both hands, the harp silent behind her, the morning light falling flat and clear through the rose canes onto the floor of the small saloon. And she understood, in the specific, physical way that certain understandings arrive, not as thought, but as sensation. The way the harp's vibration had moved through the soundboard into Mary's palm. That the thing she had been carrying for 6 weeks had been carried by someone else as well, in the parallel dark, and that they had been walking toward each other without knowing it, and were now standing in the same room. She opened the Edinburgh collection to the first page. She played. The next morning she wrote to Edmund. The letter was different from the others. No arithmetic, no careful registers, no constructed optimism. She wrote, "Something has changed, Edmund. I cannot say more than that yet, but I think, I am almost certain, that the December sum will not fall where I feared it would. Trust me for a little longer." She sealed it and left it on the hall table. She did not run the arithmetic again. For the first time in 4 months, the numbers stayed where she put them. What she did not know, because Julian had managed the information in his careful way, was that Tibbet had already been in correspondence with a retired officer of Julian's acquaintance, Colonel Charles Ashby, who had served with the Northumberland Regiment and now kept a house in Bath and a wide network of active professional contacts. Tibbet had written at Julian's private instruction 3 days before the morning in the small saloon. A quiet, specific inquiry about the availability of a commission at the current intake, for a young man of good family and no active experience. Ashby had replied within 2 days, which was itself information. The speed suggested he had been half expecting such a request, or something like it, because men of Ashby's type, large, loud in company, genuinely efficient beneath the surface noise, tended to receive this kind of favour call and process it immediately, rather than let it accumulate. He would be attending the Eastmore ball as a standing invitation guest. He had been told, in Tibbet's careful language, to expect an introduction. Edmund did not know any of this. Rosund did not know any of this. The chain of it, Julian's instruction, Tibbet's letter, Ashby's reply, the introduction planned for the evening of the ball, had been assembled in the East Wing study and the secretary's small office without the knowledge of the person it was designed to help. In the way that certain kinds of care are administered, not to be seen, not to be thanked for, but simply to be done. The ball preparations absorbed the household from the Wednesday onward. Mrs. Hatch moved through the house with the contained, kinetic authority of a general whose army is competent but requires continuous coordinating pressure. The reception rooms were opened and aired. Beeswax was applied to the ballroom floor in long, slow strokes by a pair of footmen who had been borrowed from the Marsdens for the purpose. The cold house was stripped of its remaining narcissi and several pots of forced amaryllis that had been coming on since October. Mary was taken off kitchen duties for 2 days and assigned to table folding and arrangement work, which suited her temperament precisely. She liked order, and she liked the particular satisfaction of a linen corner folded exactly right. And she moved through the work with the quiet completeness of someone doing a thing they are good at. On the Friday before the ball, Rosund asked Dawes, who had been reinstated through Lady Tryphina's intervention and Julian's quiet retroactive endorsement within 48 hours of his dismissal, and who had returned to his duties without comment and without visible grievance, only with a somewhat heightened level of general alertness, whether the north room, the small morning room where the portrait hung, might be left unlocked during the ball. "Not for the guests," she said. "I only thought, if the house is full of noise, it might be good to have one room where the noise doesn't come." Dawes looked at her with the expression of a young man who has recently learned that the world is more complicated than he had previously understood, and has decided to take this as useful professional development. "I'll see to it," he said. On the morning of the ball itself, a Saturday, grey and cold in the way that early December is grey and cold in the English Midlands. A cold that has abandoned the pretense of being temporary. Rosund came down early and found Julian already in the morning room. He was standing at the window with a cup of tea, looking at the garden. He turned when she came in. "I keep finding you in this room," she said. "You keep opening it," he said. There was something in this, not quite a smile, but the structural predecessor to one, the facial arrangement from which a smile would shortly follow. She had come to know this predecessor. It was one of the things she had come to know about him that she had no category for when she arrived. She sat in the chair nearest the portrait. He did not sit, but he shifted so that he was no longer looking at the garden, he was looking at the room. "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he said. "Are you certain?" He looked at her with a patience that was no longer managed, that had become simply his. "I was certain before I told you," he said. "I told you so that you would have time to decide if you were." "I am," she said. He set down the cup. He crossed to the chair where she sat, and he took her hand, both hands, drawing them up from her lap, holding them in the straightforward and entirely serious way of someone performing a small ceremony that will precede a larger one. He looked at the slight tremor in her fingers that had been there since October and had not entirely gone, and he held her hands until it stilled. "The Edinburgh book," he said. "Will you play from it tonight?" "If you like." "I would like the house to be full of music," Julian said. "I think it has been quiet long enough." He let her hands go. He picked up his tea and went to the door and paused there with the cup in his hand. And Rosund watched him stand in the doorway of the room his mother had loved and look at it, at the portrait, at the morning light, at whatever it was he was adding up. Then he looked at her. "Tonight," he said again, and went. She sat alone in the morning room. The portrait above the fireplace held its expression of the almost smile. The light of a December morning falling across it in the same flat, clarifying angle that the November light had used. From somewhere in the depths of the house came the particular organised percussion of ball preparations. The thump of furniture being moved. The muffled authority of Mrs. Hatch's voice giving instructions. The sweep of a polishing cloth on the ballroom floor. The house was waking up. Rosund reached out and set her palm on the arm of the chair beside her. The chair Julian had sat in during the morning room session. The chair nearest the portrait. The fabric was cold, and then it was warm. Somewhere below, in the kitchen passage, a single clear note rang out. The specific note of a finger placed on a harp string, by someone still learning where the notes live, feeling for them in the morning quiet. Mary, who had an hour before the table work resumed, playing the one chord she knew. The household moved around it, and the note held in the air of the morning room for a long, suspended moment, before dissolving, not into silence, but into the sounds of a house that had remembered what it was for. 11 days had become 9 days, had become this one. And what Rosund did not yet know was that Lady Honoria had been watching the morning room window from the east corridor for the past 10 minutes, and had seen the two figures inside it, and had made the final calculation that told her the private approach had already closed, and that the ball was now the only remaining occasion. The curtains moved. The cold came through the glass. Rosund withdrew her hand from the arm of the chair, stood, and went to find her dress. The ballroom at Eastmore had not been opened since the summer before the late Duchess died, and it showed, not in dilapidation, because Mrs. Hatch had seen to it that the room was maintained, but in a specific quality of hush that rooms acquire when they have been preserved rather than inhabited. The hush of a place that remembers what it was for and has been waiting without impatience for the occasion to arrive. The chandeliers had been brought down on their chains 3 days prior, cleaned crystal drop by crystal drop, and rehung. The beeswax on the floor, applied by the borrowed Marsden footman in long, deliberate strokes, gave the boards a dark gloss that caught the candlelight and threw it back in warm, unsteady panels. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the room smelled of hot wax and hothouse flowers, and the particular sweet, sharp smell of a coal fire working hard against a cold December night. And it sounded, for the first time in nearly a decade, like a room with people in it. Rosund was positioned at the far end of the room, near the windows, with the harp. The Edinburgh collection was open on the music stand before her. She had set it there not because she needed to read from it, but because it was the right object to have present. And she understood by now the relationship between the right object and the right room. She had placed her mother's green shawl over the stand beneath it, as she had always done, a habit so old it had become invisible to her. The green was visible to anyone who looked, though most people in a ballroom do not look at music stands. The guests arrived between 7:30 and 9. 112 by Mrs. Hatch's final count, drawn from the county's various households, with the addition of several London visitors currently wintering in the neighbourhood. The Marsdens came. The Miss Denhams came. Mr. Partridge came, resplendent in a waistcoat of deep claret that did justice to neither his complexion nor his role in the preceding weeks, though he appeared unaware of either deficiency. Lady Tryphena arrived early, and situated herself near the fireplace with the strategic patience of a woman who intends to watch the entire evening from a position of maximum visibility. Colonel Charles Ashby arrived at 8:15. He was a large man. Large in the way of someone who has spent 30 years in uniform and has never quite stopped carrying it. With a broad, open face, iron grey side whiskers, and the specific social fluency of a man who has been comfortable in rooms of every description and treats a Regency ballroom with the same efficient good humour he would extend to a regimental mess. He moved through the assembled company with a handshake deployed like a precision instrument, finding Julian within 4 minutes of his arrival and speaking to him briefly, in the low, direct register that men use when the courtesy is genuine and the business is already understood. Julian received him with warmth, the specific warmth he showed only to people he had trusted for a long time, which Rosund, watching from the harp, could now read. She had learned to read him the way she had learned to read a room before playing, by attending to what it needed rather than what it was performing. She saw Ashby's hand on Julian's shoulder for a moment, saw Julian's answering nod, and understood that what had been arranged in Tibbitt's careful correspondence had arrived in the room as something real. Edmund was there. He had been invited by a note delivered directly to his lodgings in the market town 3 miles distant, signed by Julian's secretary, in language that was warm without being effusive and precise without being cold. He had arrived at 7:45, alone, in a hired coat that was clean and fitted badly, and he was standing near the supper room doorway when Rosund first saw him across the length of the ballroom. He had the look of a young man trying very hard not to look like a young man trying very hard, and it was one of the most familiar expressions she had ever seen on a human face. She smiled at him once, briefly, from the harp. He squared his shoulders and managed something in return. The first 2 hours of the evening passed in the ordinary currency of a well-run ball: dancing, conversation, the circulation of supper and wine, the specific ebb and flow of company reorganizing itself around new combinations of interest and obligation. Rosund played. The Edinburgh collection gave her country airs and Scots reels, and 2 slow measures she had not played before, running her sight through them quietly before the guests were thick enough for anyone to notice a slight hesitation. The room received the music in the way that ballroom music is generally received, as atmosphere rather than content, heard rather than listened to, and this was entirely appropriate. She was not playing for the room tonight in the private way she had played for it in the small saloon. She was playing for the occasion, which required a different quality of attention, and received it. Julian moved through the room as host with the composed, unhurried manner she had come to understand as his natural register when he was functioning rather than enduring. He spoke with the Marsdens. He accepted a cup of claret from a footman and did not appear to drink it. He paused near the harp twice in the course of the evening, not to speak to her, not to draw attention to the proximity, simply to stand for a moment in the vicinity of the music, and each time he moved on before anyone could attach significance to the pause. Honoria had positioned herself near the centre of the room. She had done it early, before the dancing, claiming a location from which the room's natural acoustics would carry a voice, without requiring its owner to raise it. Rosund noticed the position and understood it, and understood also that Julian had noticed it, and that Lady Trefina by the fireplace had noticed it, and that the information was therefore fully distributed. At 9:30, in the natural pause between a reel and the next set, when the room drew breath and the musicians, a string quartet hired from the nearest town, made the small adjustments of tuning and positioning that briefly stilled the noise, Lady Honoria spoke. She did it beautifully, in the technical sense. She had the gift for framing a revelation as a concern, and a concern as a reluctant duty, and a duty as something performed at considerable personal cost to oneself. And she deployed this gift in full measure. She spoke of the harpist, whom she had found charming and whose talent she admired genuinely, but of whose circumstances she had learned with some distress. She said the word brother with delicate sympathy. She said the word debts in the tone of someone for whom the word is painful. She said that of course the manner in which a person managed their private financial arrangements was entirely their own affair, and she said this in a register that communicated the exact opposite of what the word stated. She did not use the word company. She had learned in the preceding weeks that she did not need to. The room had already been prepared, and the prepared room fills in its own blanks. The silence that followed was not the ballroom silence of a dropped glass or a shouted word. It was the silence of 100 people adjusting their weight simultaneously. A subtle redistribution of attention and posture that moved through the company like a change in pressure. Near the supper room door, Edmund had gone very still. Near the fireplace, Lady Trefina had set down her wineglass on the mantel and folded her hands. Rosund took her hands from the harp strings. She was standing at full height beside the instrument, facing the room, with the Edinburgh collection open on the stand behind her, and the green shawl below it, and her mother's unnamed music somewhere in the house where she had last set it down. She had known this moment was coming. She had been carrying the knowledge of it for 11 days, and in the carrying, she had rehearsed various versions of what she would do when it arrived, how she would hold herself, what expression she would wear, whether she would speak. What she had not rehearsed was the specific quality of stillness that arrived in her body now, which was not resignation and not defiance, but something closer to the feeling of setting a very heavy thing down on a table after a long time of holding it at arm's length. She looked at Lady Honoria. Honoria met the look with the composed expression of someone who has completed a necessary action and is prepared for its consequences. Then Julian spoke. He was standing 15 feet from the centre of the room, nearer the east windows than the floor, and he did not move into the centre. He did not require the centre. His voice carried because the room had arranged itself to receive it. Not because it was loud, because it was not, but because a room of 100 people, when its most powerful occupant begins to speak in a tone that signals finality, adjusts its acoustics accordingly. He said that Miss Renham had come to Eastmore in service of a debt she had not made, and a brother she had not failed, and that the manner in which she had done this, without appeal, without complaint, without the use of any advantage she might have asked for and declined to ask for, described a quality of character that the assembled company was fully entitled to know about. He said that the circumstances of her family's misfortune had been used tonight to suggest something about her person, and that he found this use inadequate. Not wrong, precisely, but inadequate, as using a map of a field to describe the sky is not wrong, but misses the relevant geography entirely. There was no oratory in it. It was not a speech built for applause. It was a man stating plainly what he had observed, at close range, over the course of 6 weeks, in a house that had been silent long enough to make observation reliable. Then he crossed the room to her. The crossing took perhaps 12 seconds and was entirely visible to every person present, and everyone present understood what it meant before he arrived. The room held its breath, in the way that only a room witnessing an irreversible thing can hold it. He reached into the lapel of his dark coat and unpinned a brooch. It was small, silver, a simple oval set with a piece of jet at the centre. A mourning token. Old. The kind of object worn close to the body for years, until it acquires the temperature of the person carrying it. His mother's. He had worn it on the inside of his lapel, against the lining, where no guest would see it, and where he had placed it every morning for 8 years, without examining why. He held it out to Rosund in his open palm. He said, "I am asking you to stay permanently, not as a harpist, as my wife." He said it to her, not to the room, at the volume appropriate to 2 people standing close together, which the room received anyway in its absolute stillness. The Edinburgh collection is already yours. The morning room is already yours. I would like to add the rest to the house, if you are willing. The candles guttered very slightly in the draught from the east windows, and the sound of their movement, the small, soft percussion of living flame, was audible in the silence. Rosund looked at him. She looked at the brooch in his palm, the jet at its centre catching the candlelight with the deep, unreflective darkness of a stone that absorbs rather than returns. She thought of the inscription in the Edinburgh collection, for the room, not the audience. And she thought of her mother's hand on the page with the slightly blurred ink. And she thought of none of these things at length, because the thought arrived whole rather than in sequence. She took the brooch from his hand. She said, "Yes." The silence lasted 1 further second. Then from somewhere near the supper room door came the sound of a single pair of hands, slow, deliberate, the kind of applause that is not performance, but decision. And when Rosund found the source, it was an old man she recognised as the squire from the neighbouring estate, a broad, red-faced man of 70, who had known the Eastmore family since Julian's father, and who was clapping with the unhurried conviction of someone exercising a right. The sound spread. Not instantly, not all at once. There were people in the room for whom spreading was a more considered process. But it spread. And within 30 seconds, it had the quality of a room that has found its common mind. Edmund, at the supper room door, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the ceiling. It was not an effective suppression. He appeared to be aware of this, and to find it only moderately catastrophic. Lady Honoria left the room quietly, in the middle of the applause, by the near door. She went without ceremony and without hurry, in the manner of a person who has made a wager and lost it cleanly, and intends to leave the table with the same composure they brought to it. Agnes was waiting in the corridor with her wrap. They did not discuss the evening on the way to the guest rooms, which was its own form of language. Rosund had not looked toward the door when Lady Honoria left. She did not need to. She was looking at Julian, who was looking at her with the expression she had first seen, weeks ago, as something she could not categorize, and could now, from this distance, name entirely. Colonel Ashby reached Edmund sometime in the next half hour, during the supper interval, in the easy way of a man who has been pointed at a destination and proceeds to it without making the approach feel deliberate. He introduced himself with his regimental history and a handshake that left no ambiguity about its origins. Edmund listened with the expression of someone receiving information that seems too favourable to be accurate and is looking for the correction. The correction did not come. Ashby ate a substantial amount of the cold pheasant and told Edmund 3 stories about the army, 2 of which were funny and 1 of which was instructive, and by the end of the supper interval had proposed, in the casual register of a man mentioning a practical arrangement, that Edmund come to his house in Bath the following Thursday and they would see about the commission. Edmund came to find his sister before the dancing resumed. He did not say anything useful. He said her name once and then stopped, which was the most honest available response to the evening's events. She put her arm through his, and they stood together for a moment beside the harp, the Edinburgh collection still open on the stand, and the green shawl beneath it in the candlelight, the same green as the lavender field in the watercolour in Lady Tryphina's sitting room, the same green as a forcing bed in winter, pressing upward in the dark toward a light it can't yet see. Lady Tryphina passed them on her way back from the fireplace, and paused long enough to set her hand briefly on Rosund's arm, once, firmly, without sentiment, and then continued on. Because there are women of 61 who understand that the best gift you can give a young person at the right moment is your absence, and Lady Tryphina was one of them. It was near the door of the ballroom, at the close of the evening, that Rosund found Dawes. He was standing at the threshold where the servants' corridor met the ballroom entrance, the boundary between his domain and the formal occasion, with the specific expression of a young man who has had an unusually eventful month and found that it has resolved in a direction he endorses. His eyes were wet. He appeared to be fully aware of this and to have decided it did not require management. Rosund looked at him. He gave a small, inadequate shrug. She nodded once, which was sufficient. He withdrew into the corridor before the expression on his face became any more inconvenient to either of them. The guests departed by midnight. The house settled. The footman moved through the ballroom collecting glasses. Mrs. Hatch directed the restoration of the supper room with the contained kinetic authority of someone returning order to a space that had briefly entertained chaos and must not be allowed to develop a taste for it. In the morning, when the first grey light came through the east-facing windows of the house, Julian unlocked the door at the end of the upper corridor. The key was with Mrs. Hatch, as Dawes had said on the first evening. Julian had asked for it the night before, after the guests had gone and the house had quieted to its deep winter silence, and Mrs. Hatch had taken it from her ring without comment and placed it in his hand, with the expression of someone returning something that was always his to ask for. The room held the particular cold of a space that has been closed for 8 years, not damp, but deep, the cold of absorbed time. The late Duchess's harp stood in the corner under a Holland sheet, a long, draped shape in the grey light. The furniture was as it had been, the pianoforte against the north wall, the small chairs arranged as if for a recital that had been postponed indefinitely. The curtains were drawn. Julian crossed the room and opened them, and the flat, cold, clarifying morning light came through the east window in the same angle it had come through the morning room below. The light that showed things as they were. He uncovered the harp. He carried it himself, with care, out of the room and down the corridor, and into the place where it would be tuned and played and heard again. The specific destination mattering less in this moment than the act of carrying it out. He left the door open behind him. The Holland sheet lay folded across the arm of the empty chair, the sheet that had covered the harp for 8 years, released now, at rest. The morning light moved across the floor of the room in its slow, patient way. From somewhere below, through the open door and the open corridor and the 2 flights of stairs and the small saloon at the western end of the ground floor, there was no music yet, only the house in its first winter light, with all its doors standing open, waiting in the ordinary way of rooms that have remembered what they are for.